I'd like to officially call to order Planning Commission meeting, City of Sebastopol for March 14th, 2023. Ask for a roll call.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly.
Here.
Commissioner Ottinger has an excused absence she had let me know about, as does Commissioner Burns. Vice Chair Fritz.
Here.
And Chair Fernandez.
Here.
So we do have 3 members tonight, which means we do have a quorum.
Right, thank you. Moving on to item number 2, comments from the public on items not on the agenda.
We did receive one comment, which was forwarded to commissioners last week. One was for an item not on the agenda regarding sculpture at Ives Park. And I will note the artist is in the midst of repairing that. And so that will be remounted as soon as he has completed. He just got back into town and he's working on that now. And then the other item was for the parklet item that we received. And those are available at the back of the room if anyone needs a copy.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on to item number 3, statements of conflict of interest. Any commissioners has any conflict of interest? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to item number 4, approval of minutes. Does anyone have a change or addition to the minutes? I actually have something.
No changes.
Okay.
No changes.
Thank you. Paul, do you have any? Okay, I just have one on page 10. Let's see, kind of the middle of the page there, it says Chair Fernandez opened public comment and invited the applicant to speak. So it really should just be that I invited the applicant to speak.
Okay, thank you. I see that.
And that's all I have. Okay, then looking for a motion for approval of the minutes.
I move we approve the minutes of February 14th.
Okay,
I'll second that.
okay, we have a motion and a second, and if no further discussion, then I will call for the vote.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly,
Yes.
Vice Chair Fritz,
Aye.
and Chair Fernandez.
Aye.
And that passes 3-0 with 2 absent.
Okay, thank you. Have no public hearings scheduled, and so we're going to move on to item number 6A, parklet guidelines update.
Thank you. To introduce this item, we do have our city engineer, Mario Landeros, here tonight, as well as the team that has been working on them. I will let Mario introduce his fellow team members. And I will note this group has been working with the design guidelines subcommittee. They've had a couple of meetings with that group, which Vice Chair Fritz is a member of, along with 2 design review board members.
Okay.
So Mario, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. And yes, good evening, commissioners. My name, as Carrie mentioned, is Mario Landeros. I am the contract city engineer. And I'm here tonight to make a brief presentation on the draft new parklet program guidelines for Sebastopol. Let's see, I'm going to ask for a little bit of sharing capacity if I have that already. Part of the brief presentation is the making my way here technology wise, trying to find my way. And I hope you all have that now. Excellent. Okay. So yes, the parklet draft guidelines. First, some introductions. And after making the introductions, just want to briefly let you know what we'll be going through. I'll be describing the purpose of the meeting tonight and providing you a little bit of background that led us to being here tonight. We'll talk briefly about the parklets in both Caltrans right-of-way and in the city roadways. Then we'll look forward to the next steps, what what we have to look forward to. So with me tonight, as Carrie mentioned, is the GHD team that worked on the parklet guidelines. We have a senior traffic project manager, Frank Penry, who is overseeing the work, and transportation engineer, Kara Bryant, who did the lion's share of putting the guidelines together. And after making the presentation, Frank, Kara, as well as myself will be glad to take your questions. So the purpose for tonight's meeting is to receive your input for the draft guidelines in 3 significant areas. And that would be the design elements and features for the parklets, operations and maintenance of the parklets, and as mentioned earlier, looking ahead, the permit process. All right, first a little brief background and to how we got here tonight. Some of you may recall back in 2015, City Council directed and authorized staff to develop the submittal package and to include submittal requirements, establish a review process, as well as construction requirements. Of course, no major activity occurred on this, that is up until the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. And during which time temporary parklets were sought and obtained through a lenient, much more lenient Caltrans encroachment permit process that allowed temporary parklets to remain up until the end of 2022. During 2022, Caltrans started a new use agreement leasing procedure for parklets in Caltrans right away. And also in the fall of 2022, Council directed that an application for Caltrans encroachment permit under the new procedures be sought for the one parklet on South Main Street, as well as directed staff to develop new design guidelines. Okay, we're going to talk about parklets in Caltrans right away. As mentioned, under the new user agreement procedure, parklet design has to meet Caltrans standards and requirements for parklets within Caltrans right away. There is an annual lease amount to be paid, that's $6,000 per year, and that is subject to periodic annual increases. And parklets, they must continue to be used for general public use, designated as park and recreation use only. Excuse me. And as such, for full public use, private business signage, advertisement, or any other commercial or vending or table services are strictly prohibited. At the time of submittal, engineered plans and specifications will be required. Bonding and insurance requirements are also to be met, and there must be an environmental review to be satisfied. Parklets, they must be maintained and upkept. And while business owners or adjacent property owner would be considered the parklet sponsor in Caltrans right away, the city would be considered the parklet owner. For parklets on city roadways. Okay. Parklets in the city roadways, they will submit to an encroachment permit application, which must be completed with and submitted with the parklets application. The design must meet city standards and requirements for parklets in city right away. And we will also need engineered plans and specs. There are bonding and insurance requirements to be satisfied, as well as environmental review compliance before the parklets may be installed. Parklet owners are held responsible for the maintenance and the upkeep. And for parklets in city right away, the business applying for the parklet is considered the parklet owner. Briefly, let's go through the design guidelines. First up, discussion on allowable configurations. The guidelines cover generally 4 types of configurations. There is a parallel parklet, which uses the parallel parking space in front of a business, and it's generally limited to that frontage at that business. A diagonal parklet, while Sebastopol, to my knowledge, doesn't have any diagonal parking spaces on the city streets, there is a diagonal parklet design, or rather the parklet would be able to take the diagonal spaces fronting the business, should we ever convert or provide diagonal spaces in town. There's also a sidewalk parklet, which uses the sidewalk area adjacent to the building. And for these, a minimum 48-inch straight walkway must be maintained open. And then there is the realignment parklet. And this parklet, what it does is it uses the sidewalk space, or the parking space, I should say, to reroute pedestrians around a service area and sidewalk, generally right adjacent to the business for its services. It should be noted that the two parklets, sidewalk parklets and realignment parklets, those configurations would not be allowed in Caltrans right away. Continuing on guidelines under the topic of canopies and coverings. Where coverings are used, they can be tents, umbrellas, or built structures. And these coverings must be inspected and approved by the fire code officials. And permits would be required where an aggregate area of over 400 feet, minimum 400 to beyond 400 is covered. Any textile coverings used must be fire resistant certified. There are minimum head clearance requirements, that being 90 inches. Ideally, if we can get 96, the better. Cooking under these canopies and coverings will be prohibited. Coverings and canopies, they must have openings to allow airflow and proper sight lines. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. And for layout or diagram of the coverings, these must be shown at the time the permit application is submitted. The installations, they should not block any fire apparatus access. And there needs to be a fire apparatus access within 150 feet of all sides of the coverings or canopies, with the clearance of no less than 3 foot every 20 feet. So in this manner, to avoid the appearance of a wall of parklets. Heating devices. These are certainly popular into the evenings, but they will require additional permit from the fire department. Allowable portable type of heating that are used are the electric type or an outdoor gas-fired device, either propane or natural gas. And for use of these heaters, they must not pose any sort of a hazard and cannot be easily tipped over. Propane heaters, they will require additional permit through the fire department and hazardous hazardous materials. They will require the Cooper permit. And then when not in use, propane tanks must be properly stored. Looking to lighting. Lighting can be installed within or over the parklet, often by incorporating some type of a post element into the design. And lighting needs to be placed in a manner and to brightness levels that avoid distraction to drivers. Certainly, use of disco balls, neon signs, or any flashing lights or rotating lights will not be permitted. And lighting that is installed above 48 inches, it must be shielded from the roadway and shine only onto the parklets. The bulbs for lighting, a warm or soft white is recommended, not more than 3,500 Kelvin temperature, and a brightness level of not more than 450 lumens for each bulb. It's encouraged for lighting to be solar or battery powered. And depending on parklet conditions, the approved lighting for each parklet may vary at the discretion of the viewer. If the lighting is at any time deemed to be a distraction to the drivers, they must be modified or removed. On the subject of parklet beautification, The parklet owners, sponsors, they are required to regularly clean and maintain their parklets and the surrounding area around the parklet. Parklet spaces, they should be beautified through the use of some type of landscaping. A few examples of this would be use of planter boxes, hanging planters, or raised beds. Recommended plant types are that they be drought tolerant, preferably native. Ideas would be edible plants, fragrant, and of some sort of a seasonal interest. And certainly interesting architecture or architectic elements are encouraged to be incorporated in the design. As for seating, this can be integrated into the structure. It could be integrated in planters or brought about some other creative feature. They could be movable tables and chairs. They can be, and they will need to be removed and stored or locked up with cables at the end of each day. Tables and chairs, they must meet with ADA requirements and must be placed and positioned to ensure adequate spacing between patrons and other table areas and dining areas. A quick note here, I did mention it in the, when speaking about the Caltrans parklets. I want to mention that while the seating as described here is all allowable in those Caltrans parklets, that seating and table must be distinct from the adjacent business. So, you know, if a business has some sort of an iconic seating design, that cannot be used in that parklet in Caltrans right away adjacent to the business. Mentioned earlier about sightlines and airflow. So for use, for purposes of sightlines and airflow, sidewalls, they must adhere to the 50% rule, and that being that at least 50% of the combined sidewall area, including all four sides, it must be unobstructed around the parklet. And sidewalls may only be in place during times of direct sunlight, rain, or heavy wind, not used throughout. Permanent or continuous OPEC walls between 42 and 90 inches will not be permitted at any time. And the parklets, they shall not create any sort of unsafe condition by limiting necessary sight from the drivers to signage, to traffic, to pedestrians. As for signage, all signage must meet the city requirements. Those requirements shall remain in place. And the parklets, they may not be used to hang banners, promotional material, or any other type of signage, except with the one exception. In the parklets and Caltrans right-of-way, signage is required that denotes use of the parklet as public use only, prohibits smoking and consumption of alcohol. And at no time will a business be allowed to attach, to fix, or secure any signage to any power pole, to trees, street lamps, any sort of city-owned features out the street. Parklets using the parking stalls or otherwise blocking their addresses, they must provide a numerical address on the street side of the parklet so that it is easily viewable from the roadway, and must use a self-reflective address sign with individual numbers that are no more than 4 inches in height, or excuse me, no less than 4 inches in height. The design guidelines require the use of road barriers as these parklets are going to exist in active travel roadways, the active travel way. Vehicle deterrents such as heavy planters, filled wine barrels, or other heavy objects, they must be installed within the parking space adjacent to the travel lane and no more than 6 feet apart along the side perimeter of the parklets. The deterrents, such as the barricades, planters, wine barrels, or other objects, they must be filled with water, soil, sand, or any other heavy material to keep them in place. And all vehicle deterrents, they must be located entirely within the approved parking space. And the design and placement must be approved by city staff. So concerning construction guidelines and the permit process, and primarily for city roadways, use of parklet frame needs to be freestanding, structural foundation that rests on the street or the curb. No feature or structural components may be permanently attached to the street or curb or any of the adjacent planting strip. There must be no attachment to any existing building or piece of infrastructure, whether it's public or private, unless first receiving approval. And businesses, they cannot leave materials within the public right-of-way outside of the parklet, including during construction. The construction is required to be completed in a timely manner and take no more than 3 weeks from start. And when the permit expires, businesses will need to repair any damage done to the public street, public property in the right-of-way. At the curb interface, parklets, the design must be such that stormwater flows and drainage is allowed along the curb. And if decking is proposed, the top of the decking needs to be flush with the curb and creating no more than a ½ inch of horizontal gap. It must be level with the adjacent sidewalk, and there's a vertical deviation of maximum ½ inch, and must be accessible at several locations by pedestrians. The parklets must have a seamless connection to the existing curb and meet ADA requirements. And in some cases, ramp may be required to meet those ADA requirements. As far as public utilities, the parklets, they must not block any stormwater drainage, must not block hydrants or transit stops, not block driveways, manholes, or any of the public utilities. And at no time shall any business tap into the city-owned power, water, or any other public utilities. A little more on sightlines here. The design of the parklets, they must ensure visibility to passing traffic and pedestrians. And they must, there must be this opening 3 foot every 20 feet for pedestrian and fire access. And again, this avoids the creating of a parklet wall. It must be located at least one parking stall away from street corners or a crosswalk, and where there is no parking space markers, minimum of 20 feet from the street corner. There must be a minimum overhead clearance of 90 inches. As mentioned earlier, preferably up to 96. And this is where parklets have a canopy or coverings. And barriers, they must not rise over 42 inches in height. As far as the permit process, what the plan is that for an applicant to submit the permit application to the city engineering department, we provide contact information there. And the permit coordinator will collect all materials and provide the initial review for completeness. And we'll be looking for signatures, detailed map and layout. We'll be looking for acknowledgement by initialing parking permit agreements and guidelines. Of course, the liability insurance with all the required endorsements and any other additional material, photos, maps, etc. Then the coordinator will route a completed package to the design review board. Now, the board may request a virtual or on-site meeting with the applicant to review the application, and may also submit comments and requirements to the permit coordinator, which will be included in the final permit. So once the process is completed, the permit coordinator will assemble all of these additional conditions, requirements, and so forth, and will have the applicant sign the final permit, and the applicant receives it. As for fees, at the time of application, well, there is no application fee per se, but the planning building department, they do charge the applicant. It's on a cost recovery basis for time spent reviewing the drawings, as well as for inspection, construction, for all of the approved building permits. And building permits, in some cases where the applicant is choosing to do a more elaborate system and include any sort of construction overhead, a building permit will be required. Additional fees may apply. It's depending on the parklet location and use, and these fees would be assigned based on the current master schedule. At the time the fees are applied, should have. There's also a neighbor notification and approval and complaints, and the applicant must notify adjacent businesses of the parklet plan. Support and approval of the immediate neighbors and adjacent property owners by way of signature is required. So any concerns or issues are encouraged to be handled between the neighbors in a peaceful, diplomatic manner. But if a resolution cannot be found, the permit coordinator may be contacted for filing any official grievance. And then from there, we go to the next step. So with that is the presentation. And as mentioned earlier, Kira, Frank, and myself are available to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who's gonna get started on that? Paul, you were kind of involved with that. Do you have any comments you want to kind of start us off with, or questions?
Not really at this time. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to see if you had any comments for that. So any questions from commissioners to Mario?
I have two.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I must have maybe missed it. So the city isn't going to charge fees unless for certain circumstances. What is the Caltrans fee?
Yeah, I'll clarify that on the cost of the fees, but on the Caltrans permit, there is an annual it's an annual lease of $6,000. At this time, that's what it sits at. Caltrans has given indication that they're looking to try to reduce that cost after the initial pushback from the city. So they're trying to work with us on that. I've not heard back from them this time. As for parklets in the city right away, let me just scroll back up here under fees pretty quickly. Yeah, I did mention that there is no application fee for submitting the parklet. However, there are charges associated with the review time spent by the planning and building department.
That's right.
Yeah.
Second question is about can there be several owners or sponsors to one parklet, or is that just for that business that it's adjacent?
Let me I'll start that, and Kira, Frank, if you have anything to add into that. But I do not believe there is anything in the guideline that restricts that to only one fronting owner. However, there are still within the guidelines provisions that need to be followed. For example, the spacing between the parklets. What is that? No less than 3 feet. Every 20 feet, I believe it is. So some sort of a breakup in the appearance of the parklet, so they're not just one continuous long wall of parklets. Kira, do you have anything to add to that? I'm not sure if there's any restriction to that.
Yeah, there's not really in terms of like how many people can sponsor. I think really what it is, it's a parklet, approach the city and say, we want to install a parklet here. Can we be a parklet sponsor? Because the way that Caltrans is working is that they want the city to be the technical owner through their permit, their encroachment permit. And so it'll pretty much just be whatever businesses we want a parklet will approach the city, and then that in turn will make them the sponsor. If that answers that question. It kind of cut out for me. My internet's kind of being a little funky, but is that kind of what the question was?
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit there.
Yes, suffices to say, Mario, you're correct. There's nothing that would preclude as long as it all meets the other guidelines.
Mhm.
Linda, do you have any other questions?
No, not this time, thanks.
Paul, do you have?
I just had one question because this came up several times about the canopy clearance. If you have some kind of overhead structure, that 90 inches is the minimum, but the preference is for 96 inches. I'm just wondering if there's a reason we're not just saying 96 inches, if that's what we really want. Is there a reason why 90 inches is allowed?
I'm going to just answer briefly, and then if Frank or Kira have any additional information. Admittedly, at the time that the council directed staff back last fall in 22 to go forward and put these guidelines together, they did ask the question, had other local agencies, cities, neighboring cities, put together plans, and perhaps maybe we could borrow, if you will, from already established guidelines. We did reach out to Healdsburg, City of Healdsburg, and the City of Sonoma, and they very happily agreed and allowed us to borrow and use their guidelines as a model. So I'm going to just suggest that we used some of this legacy type information from their works and included it into ours. But beyond that, I cannot say if there is any sort of code requirement, ADA clearance requirement for that vertical clearance. I mean, it's simple enough that we could find out, but I don't have the direct answer on that, Paul.
So Mario, I think the question that Vice Chairperson is asking is the 90 inch, which is 7.5 feet, just to translate that document. I believe that probably is the is the clearance required by code. But he's asking, but we wanted it to be 8 feet. Why can't we just make it, customize it for us and make it 8 feet? And I believe that's the input the design review committee had to the group.
I guess I just want to follow that up with a question about like table umbrellas, because those probably are not 8 feet, but I don't know what they are. But I think they should be allowed. So I guess there's some conflict there in that requirement to 90. If it, maybe something of the fact that it's, if it's a permanent built structure like a roof or something like that, it has to be 96 inches, but that we don't want to preclude someone from putting a table with an umbrella in it. It seems like that should be allowed as well, whatever.
Right. And I believe there would, at that point for ADA, there would be, because you have a table underneath it, there may be different guidelines, requirements for that, because you're not gonna hit an umbrella. You're gonna before you hit the table.
Yeah. I mean, typically the ADA, I think it's, elements that are below 6 foot 8 inches. So I'm not sure where the 7.5 feet came from,
Yeah.
but.
And I would just offer, Paul, on that certainly we can certainly make it less restrictive and allow for or is that more restrictive? Yeah, to make it a greater clearance by all means. I think he was just trying to probably hit the minimum and yet mention the preferable height, but shoot, why not? We could just say that. I don't see any issue to that, other than some folks will just, maybe they would have preferred hitting the minimum, but okay, they'll go to the requirement, which we could certainly make more more restrictive.
Yeah, I just think it's more clear. I mean, as a designer, it's always a little frustrating to get these like kind of, you know, this is what we really like, but if you want to do it this way, you know, you can do it that way, but I'm not really going to like it as much or what, you know, just as a little bit odd. But I do think there should be some allowance for a, you know, table umbrella kind of thing. So I think that should be written in the guidelines and some, you know, that should be captured somehow. I think that's, oh, my other question was, so and we hadn't seen this before in the subcommittee, but I see the draft we're looking at tonight does have the appendices. And I had a question about the drawings that were included in from the city of Sonoma. I mean, are those just, hey, this is what the city of Sonoma did, or is that something like how are those to be utilized? Are those, that's the requirements, like that's how it needs to be done, or I'm just questioning what that's about, what those drawings are for.
You want me to answer that one?
Address
So
that.
I believe that they're kind of there to be a sample, like standard plan of like, okay, if this is the type of output that you're going to use, this is how it should be laid out. It's not just like, this is what the city of Sonoma did. It's just, I think it just has all the standard widths, standard lengths, all that information in there. I believe it's what's written out, plus additional details about placing tables. So kind of people can get a graphical view of it.
So it's more, you're a little hard to hear, Kira, but so it's more like the drawings need to have this information, not this is kind of the design sort of standards, I guess, because like, you know, I'm looking on, for example, page 29 of the draft guidelines, and it's the temporary sidewalk extension. So the tables are on the sidewalk and that's just a way for, you know, people to walk around. I guess I'm just not sure, you know, it shows the, what do they call that, as the planters or barrels, and they're connected with you know, these elements. I'm not exactly sure what those are. So I guess I'm just trying to understand that this is just sort of like graphically you need to include this information, or this is how this must be done, I guess is my question.
Yeah.
And I think that should be clear. Like, this is the graphic information that we need. You don't need to do it this way. Like, there's a detail for, you know, at the gutter that shows kind of the construction, but you know, are you able to do that in another manner, or is this the way that we want this detail to be implemented? I guess. So I think that needs, it's not clear in my mind reading this. If I was a designer looking at this, I'm like, well, is this the detail I need to use, or is this just the information they want to have? That makes sense. And is there what, so I guess what is the intent? I'm still not sure what the intent is.
I would clarify that as it's a typical application or a sample. We included these were standard plans from the city. We didn't prepare standard plans for the city of Sebastopol. So these are, I would classify these as a sample or typical application, indicating what the drawing minimum requirements for information, that to that extent.
Okay.
We could very clearly, we could cross out the standard aspect of that in the appendix and just and apply that it's a sample, and even strike the word standard from the city's plan as well. That these aren't envisioned to be, essentially the plan itself provides the standard for design.
Mm-hmm.
These are an example or a typical sample.
Okay, that would be helpful. Yeah, because it makes it sound like this is the standard. This is what we want you to do.
I see that now.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll go ahead and make that change. Thank you for pointing that out.
I think that's all my questions for the moment.
All right, thank you. See, I might have missed this somewhere. I was trying to find where that's listed. So the applicant, once they're given approval for permit, do they need to post their information, like the permit for contact information in case somebody has a concern or complaint? Is there anything that's posted or needs to be posted?
I can maybe
Yeah.
start off on this
Mhm.
one, and Mara, you could chime in. So I think typically this is going to be, the intent is that it's along the frontage of a business. So a business couldn't say, oh, I want to have a parklet over there, over in front of their business. It would be in front of that business, or like, we do know that Sunshine Cafe and Retrograde are interested in making that one. And that would likely be one of those co-sponsored, potential parklets. So you would know to go into the business, presumably you'd know to go into the business it is right in front of. But Mario and I guess more Frank and Kira, do the other communities have some way of identifying in case there are complaints or any sort of signage related to that?
So when complaints come in on this, it's typically the association, the association of the parklet and being in front of a business. So that's a typical identifier for somebody to make a concern or lodge a interest in something going on with that particular. So that's as was noted about the where it's in front of a business, that number would be posted. So that's kind of the intent with that, is that it allows that's the connection.
Okay. And then as far as, neighboring businesses, is that like how far down the street? I mean, it's kind of nebulous as to, is it your next door business, across the street, behind you? Like, what would be considered neighboring, or how would you know that you got enough of the statements from the businesses that may be affected?
Yeah, I believe it's directly adjacent. So you're two, like if you're in the middle of someone, you're two bookend neighbors that need the approval and notification from. I believe it states that a little bit more directly in the report, but if not, I will make that change.
So a little bit difficult to hear. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, if you just do one next door, but it may affect the business down the street. I'm just curious as to, I mean, there's no guidelines really as to, how far down the street it may affect somebody. It's not really known, but I don't know, Gary, if you, how
The guidelines, the way they're written, and this is on page 14, is that the adjacent businesses that the applicant is responsible for providing and getting signatures on that. And I don't know if there's a form, Frank and Kira, that they would, get, if there's a form that they sign and say, yeah, that's okay with me, but it is just the adjacent businesses. I think what, and Mario, I know you fielded some of these comments as well during COVID. Generally, it was the adjacent businesses that were concerned, not like Sebastopol Cookie wasn't concerned about the one in front of People's Music. There was some of that just in terms of the general amount of parking along a street frontage. And I think that gets to probably Vice Chair Fritz's question about, or sorry, Linda Kelly's question about how many on a block would be allowed. I don't know if, how many folks would actually be wanting to do this, if that becomes an issue or not, and if that's an issue in other communities, or if it's sort of unlimited.
And how do you determine? So I know it says that, the applicant is to try to, work things out with the neighboring business. So is it just take one business that says, no, I don't like this, to then not to deny the application, or how would that be determined?
Well, at this point, I'll chime in on that is that as a requirement of a completed application, it does state that getting the signed approval of the adjacent neighbors immediately adjacent is a requirement of that completed package. If that cannot be obtained, certainly that leads to a kind of a contentious challenge out there if a parklet was to go in, with a neighbor always complaining about a parklet because they didn't want it in there. And so that's some indication of a location where it may not be in the best interest to go forward with it if you can't have happy neighbors to either side of this parklet.
Okay, that makes sense. And then just for staff, as far as, is there any way to kind of estimate, because it says that they would be charged time spent on the research, but it's kind of wide open. Like if I was doing an application, you know,
Yeah, you'd want to know what.
kind of range or something, you know, give me an idea.
I agree, and I can follow up directly with Mario on this one. So there is so in terms of the planning, you know, the sort of the planning charges a fee. Well, what is that fee? So I believe we have, so the step 4 for A and 4B is to basically have our design review board review it at one of their meetings. Is what I would say, actually. And so Mario, we probably want to change 4A and 4B, or actually 3, 4, and A and 4B to just be our design review process. Our design review board is not staff members. They're a public body that has public meetings. And so my thought was on that, and I believe we had discussed at the design guidelines subcommittee meetings, that we would just have the design review board review the design in an open meeting, rather than this. What you have here isn't quite as public. We have a minor design review application fee, and so we could just use that because it's not a major building, it's just a smaller piece. And so we could just use that as the fee.
Yeah, that kind of clear things up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I had. Do we need to, I mean, it just takes the recommendations. Do I need to open up for public comment, I guess? So I will do that officially.
Okay, thank you. And I will note that we do not, I do not see anyone from the public interested in commenting, but we did receive one public comment on this related to making sure that business owners are aware that they are public spaces. That comment again is posted to the website under the Planning Commission meeting page, as well as available to the commissioners.
Okay. Thank you. And no other public comment. I'll go ahead and close public comment and bring it back to the commission. And basically we're just looking for any guidance. Are we looking to approve a draft?
Yes, so Mari, did you need any action on this? There wasn't any listed in the staff report. I believe it was just the report and feedback.
Yes, that is correct. We were looking for your input, and I think we got some pretty good input today, which we will certainly incorporate. But then our next step, and I would say the only action, if you will, would be is if you would agree with the next step that we are projecting to take this document once it's been cleaned up with your input, all input to date, to the city council, with the idea of requesting adopting the guidelines.
Okay. All right. So I don't know if any commissioners have any final comments. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I did, and I brought these items up in the design guidelines subcommittee. So I just want to bring them up here again. I think, and I brought this up actually since we've been talking about parklets, but I think the city of San Francisco has an amazing document in terms of design guidelines that, I'm wondering if maybe we can include that as an appendix somehow. It just it's very comprehensive. It has really great graphics, has a lot of really great examples that I find it's much more user friendly. And I think we've incorporated a lot of what they talk about, but they just present it in a different way. Again, I'm just kind of concerned about these drawings from Sonoma. There's a lot of things in them that actually, not a lot, but there's a few things in them, like there's a drawing of the kind of attachment of the floor of the parklets. And there's actually a detail that talks about, and I know these were sort of not standards, or just sort of, kind of the drawing information, but it talks about, using a spike to attach it to the street, which I'm surprised that the city of Sonoma would allow someone to do, and I don't think we want to do that. So I'm not sure how I feel actually about these drawings from the city of Sonoma being in here at all. The more I look at them, even if they're, I don't know, there's a lot of strange information on here and things that kind of conflict with some of the stuff we actually have in our guidelines. And one of the things that's in here that I think is, it's a COVID related item, that's all this physical distancing. There's a lot of information about physical distancing in these diagrams that I don't know if we're still in that phase that those are necessary, but these are kind of long-term parklets beyond COVID. I don't know that we need to be so rigid about this. Again, the physical distancing of people and tables. Again, I understand these are not like the standard, these are just sort of drawings, but again, as a designer, like this is the information that I would be more drawn to than the text, just because it's visual, and designers are often visual people. And so I would go to this and say, oh, I need to have 6 feet between everything, and I can use a stake to drive it into the street. And there's a thing about the string lights can only be up for 90 days. And I don't know, there's a lot of details in here that I don't know that we want to refer to. So I'm maybe thinking we should just not include them because they're a little confusing. But I do like to have some graphic information. That's why I kind of brought up the San Francisco again, just because they're just graphically much, very rich, I suppose. The other thing I want, and I brought this up, kind of referring to the lights. We talk about the string lights or the Tivoli lights as being acceptable, and there's a picture of them, but then they have to be shielded, which I just find to not be very practical. If you have Tivoli lights string up above your parklet, and there's a driving lane right adjacent to the parklet, like it's going to be projecting, you're going to see them. It's not going to be a real practical way to shield those. So I just don't, I understand we don't want distraction, but the Barlow has string lights going over McKinley Street, and I don't think that anyone has run off the road because of that. I don't know. I think I'm not sure what the real problem is with that. And I think that, if you say you can do the Tivoli or string lights, but they have to be shielded, I don't think anyone will install them, because I just don't think there's a practical way to shield them.
Is that a Caltrans requirement? Or
I don't think so. And I get like no disco balls and no flashing lights and no, we don't want it to be Las Vegas and having, things moving and stuff. But if it's just a fixed light, I think that should be fine. Again, we have, and I brought this up in the design review meeting, many of the businesses on Main Street have, Christmas lights that they leave up all year round, and those aren't shielded. I can see them when I'm driving my car down the street, but it doesn't make me run my car off the road either. I don't think that that's going to be a real distraction. So I would encourage us to take that shielding requirement out. And the other thing I think is a bit overkill is this idea of, wine barrel deterrents filled with sand or soil or something. Like, if the parklet can only be 6 feet wide and a 3-foot diameter wine barrel has to be used as a barrier, you're really not left with much of a parklet at the end of the day. And again, San Francisco has been installing these for at least 15 years, and they don't have, if you see the ones in San Francisco, they don't have these big barriers along the street to prevent, something from happening. I don't know. And I don't know that there has ever been an incident. And I get it. We don't want someone to be hurt in a parklet, but I just find that kind of a requirement limits the usability of a parklet, to be quite honest. And at this point, it may be better to just leave the K rails up that we have, because then at least you have the 6 feet that you can work with. And maybe a K rail is just the solution. We just require K rails. I don't know. It's just something I wanted to bring up again, kind of to the commission, these are things I brought up in the design guidelines subcommittee. Those are my general comments. I mean, I just find that I would like to encourage these to be kind of creative and fun. If they're have these barriers and all these kind of very specific requirements, I don't see them a lot of opportunity to upgrade the parklets over the one that we currently have existing, that's a plywood floor and painted K rails with some tables on it. That's kind of what these are kind of pointing to. And, again, that's kind of what those drawings from the city of Sonoma, they're all kind of similar to what we have already, but with wine barriers instead of K rails. And I don't find that to be particularly attractive.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds reasonable. Yeah, we did, we want to make it so they're safe, but also, that someone would consider doing it. I think it's can be a positive thing. Seems to, create more ambiance, I guess. So yeah, I think good points with the lighting and that you mentioned. I'd be supportive of that, maybe taking a look at that. And Linda, if you have any additional comments on that.
Well, I'm sorry. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen different parklets down in the Bay Area, down in San Francisco, and I'm not sure if it was Berkeley or Oakland. I think it was Oakland. And I'd certainly like to have us or have design review board look at as many examples as possible. In terms of, I don't recall how much safety was around the ones that I saw down in Oakland. So it might have been San Francisco that I saw them, but I don't know if it's required by Caltrans to have like the water wall barriers or anything, or is that just what Sonoma wanted to do?
I'm curious.
And in terms of, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And with the lights, I know there is the string bulb lights that are sort of amber, and we have to go by a certain Kelvin and wattage. Maybe that'll take care of it. But I've seen ones that do have a little bit of a shield on them. So there's so many kinds of lights to buy.
I'm wondering if the city of Healdsburg had the same kind of barrier, kind of wine barrel barrier kind of requirement that the city of Sonoma has.
Yeah.
Does anyone from GHD have that information, or?
Again, I know that the wine barrels has been mentioned a few times, but I think the idea and examples from Healdsburg come to mind is that there are different features used to satisfy some sort of a barrier. At one point early on, they were using water-filled K-railing type of feature, but that's evolved into things like planters, not the big wide barrels that I think you're envisioning, but some sort of a planter filled in with the soil obviously to support the plant, some sort of a gravel ballast, and create some sort of a bulk. It's certainly, these aren't being designed or rated for any sort of a crash rating, but it does provide some type of a deterrent to a vehicle. Should a vehicle errantly kind of roll over as opposed to nothing or something real light being there. So that's there are some examples in Hillsburg and that aren't necessarily these big heavy wine barrels or K railings, but just some type of a mass filled device. I can't tell you any dimensions on that, although I don't envision them being more than maybe a couple of feet in width. Somewhere in there. Also, I was looking at some of the Sonoma examples, and it varied anywhere from the use of water-filled barriers to vertical type of deterrence with raised curb that at least provides a bit of a deterrent to a wheel. Again, depending on the speed at which an errant vehicle is to roll off its travel way. Certainly would affect how far we were to get in, but providing some kind of a deterrent is the goal here. And as far as the question about Caltrans, I will admit that not having gone through the application submittal process when it was submitted back in 2021, 2022, I don't know from that example if the K railing was a requirement to satisfy or it was a convenient means to satisfy the barrier requirement. But certainly, Caltrans at this point, they have established guidelines now. I do not recall that they call out specifically any sort of a K railing type of a device or feature be used.
Yeah, I don't think Caltrans did. And the only reason we did the K rails for these COVID parklets was that that's what the city of I'm blanking, a city in the South Bay, who was the first one to do it on a Caltrans right away. That was
Was Saratoga?
yeah, I think
Something like that.
yeah.
Someone down there.
Yeah, Saratoga, that's what they did. So we just said, well, Caltrans approved that, so let's just propose that because we know they'll approve it. It wasn't any, no one had a standard or a guideline at that point about how to do it. I mean, on a Caltrans right away. So that was just proposed as a matter of convenience and not anything else really. But I know, San Francisco doesn't really have that kind of specific requirement. And even if you don't use a wine barrel, but it's just a 2-foot wide planter, then it still just leaves you with a 4-foot wide parklet. There's just not very much space. And I understand I guess I can get the rationale. You don't want anyone to get hurt, but.
Can I ask a question? So
Yeah.
when you're talking about the width of the parking space.
Yeah.
So you're talking about, so Mario I thought the thicker deterrent was only at the two edges. You're saying that it's a 2-foot thick all along the outside of the parking space?
There was something in here about, it's not,
I think that, but I just want to make sure we're clear on that, because if you do look at the San Francisco guidelines, yeah, they'll have like a wood wall along the outside edge,
there was something about,
closest to the in line with the travel lane, but then they will have the thicker 2-foot at the two short edges of it, if you know what I mean.
I thought there's a space, 6 feet apart. So so there has to be some a wine barrel, whatever, heavy planter every 6 feet. So maybe not continuous, but I don't know. It just seems like, again, that, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to split hairs, but it just these guidelines, what we're reviewing tonight, says every 6 feet they have to be filled. Filled.
Yeah, and I don't think we even have that now. I mean, you have the
K
you have the
now.
surrounding, but you don't have within it. You don't. So I guess you have the K rail around the
K
whole
rail is
thing.
continuous, so that kind of provides the same purpose. I don't know. I just find it's going to be it could be challenging and, because, many ones I've seen are just like, along the street edge is just a continuous bench or something. And then there's like a banquette kind of thing. And then there's tables set up against it. But if you had that banquette and every 6 feet, I guess you'd have to, you can only have a 6-foot long banquette maybe. I don't know, maybe I'm making a bigger deal of it than it is, but I just find it kind of restricting and, I might stop a car that's not moving very fast on the road, but even if a wine barrel every 6 feet, if a car was coming at any speed, that's probably not going to stop it very well.
So are those barriers and do they take up space of the permitted space? Or are they outside of the permitted space and then someone, gets that whole space?
So they're within the permitted space. So the permitted space is basically the parking space width,
Okay.
which I think in most places, Mario, will be about 8 feet.
That is correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
But
of that 8 feet, it would be, so that would be the permitted space, and then within that, you would have to have some sort of barrier. I mean, you need some sort of barrier. The question between the traffic lane and where your parklet starts, the question that Vice Chair Fritz is asking is, does it need to be these really large things every 6 feet along it, or is there another alternative?
Yeah, because I was just wondering if it was on outside of that perimeter space, I guess you would be then encroaching to other parking spaces. Is that right?
Well, you'd be encroaching into I think there's something in here, and correct me if I'm wrong, where I thought there was something like you have to be like 2 feet from the travel lane. I thought there was like a distance from the travel lane before the parklet could start. That's where I got the 6
I
feet
see.
in my head from.
Oh, yeah.
I thought there was like, you had to be 2 feet from the travel lane. So if it's an 8-foot parking space, then you end up with a 6-foot parklet, but maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. I'm just looking.
I'm scrolling through to make sure. I know what you're talking about. At this point under the barriers, it only speaks about maintaining a barrier spacing no more than 6 feet apart.
Mario, are you able to pull up the sheet SP-05 on, it's in the parklet document from the city of Sonoma, because I think that shows the couple things we're talking about. Seems like a visual might help with that.
Yeah. Mario, the allowable configurations for parallel parking is 1 foot outside the edge of travel way. So
1 foot. Okay. So it'd be a 7-foot. If it's an 8-foot
exactly.
parking space, we get 7 feet left.
Okay. I'm sorry, Carrie, you were saying, looking at the, I am looking at one of the in the guidelines under the Caltrans example, their spacing requirements. This is in the state right away. That's where it does show a minimum. Yeah, it does cut it down to, is that 7 or even 6 proposed parklet location? Yeah, off of the edge line, the parking tick, 2 foot minimum before the start of the parklet.
That's from Caltrans standards.
Yeah, that was in the Caltrans.
Okay, that's where I saw that then.
Yeah. That would be in the guidelines on page 52, which is sheet 5-17 at the lower right.
Yeah,
That's out of the,
yeah, I see that.
yeah. But I was looking where else that 2 foot offset came from. Yeah, so far I'm not seeing it elsewhere.
Yeah, and Paul, I think so the drawing I just pulled up that
Yeah.
I'm sharing on the screen
Mhm.
is an example from the city of Sonoma. So it's a 1 parking space, parallel parking by 3 spaces wide. Sorry,
It's diagonal.
this is 6 diagonal spaces. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
different. That's not as much room as we would have.
Yeah. They don't have a parallel. Well, they have this kind of parallel, like if you go
Okay.
back to the first one, I think of the city of Sonoma, but that's like the walkway. idea, but that's kind of similar. And they show 1 foot, but again, if Caltrans is requiring 2 feet on their right of way, then we would have to do that on Main Street.
Right, and so Mario, were you saying it was a 1 foot or 2 foot?
It was
Caltrans is 2 feet.
It was showing it setback 2 feet minimum.
Yeah, Caltrans says 2 feet. So that, again, that makes this drawing that we're looking at here, confusing. This drawing says 1 foot, but Caltrans says 2 feet. So,
Right, and so the I see your point, Paul, that it would end up being a very narrow parklet.
yeah, I mean, like for this temporary, sidewalk extension, it works because, you're just making it for a sidewalk extension. You only need 5 feet wide for a sidewalk, but if you actually want to put some tables on that, you can look at that and see that you're not going to really fit very much in the way of a table on that. What's left of that. Yeah.
And the existing parklet on South Main, I believe it's right now complying with these requirements, possibly. Although I was trying to recall if the barrier was offset 2 feet before the parklet started. I almost seem to recall that barrier is within that 2 foot strip.
I think the barrier there is, the 2 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's an interpretation of that. The parklet proper starts at 2 foot minimum
Yeah.
for off of the parking tick. So perhaps that barrier is sufficient within. And then of course on Main Street, we also have the buffer to the bike lane plus the bike lane.
Yeah.
So it certainly in that location feels a little roomier. If that's a word there.
And I don't know how to exactly resolve that. I mean, 'cause we could say that you could put the barrier, whatever it is, outside the parklet, but I'm not sure Caltrans, we don't know if Caltrans is going to accept that or not, that 2 foot buffer zone.
Right.
If we say, oh, you can have a 6 foot wide parklet and then use that 2 foot buffer zone for your, whatever this barrier is, but then Caltrans comes back and says, no, you can't have that 2 foot zone, as you have to be everything out of that 2 foot zone. Then you'd end up with the 4 foot wide parklet potentially.
Certainly the current example, it does show that parklet. Again, I as far as the width of the parking on Main Street, don't know, it should be 8 foot. I can't see why it wouldn't be. There's plenty of space there. But the K-railing, I can share the screen for just a recollection of what's out there, but it does show that the K-railing, as you can see, it's right on that parking strip.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it takes up maybe 2 foot of the 8 foot lane, leaving that 6 foot. And that's 2 foot at the base, of course. As you can see, the K-railing tapers up.
Yeah, so Mara, it might be helpful to see if, the travel lane of the vehicle is further away. So because of the bicycle lane,
Right.
that case, and I have ridden my bicycle past this, and I've never felt like there's an issue from a bicycling perspective. I'm not a bicycle advocate. I'm just a bicyclist. My full disclaimer there. But I've never felt uncomfortable going past the parklet with it just right on that line. So is that something we can check with the Caltrans in terms of their standards? Does it need to have that 2 foot thing, a 2 foot from the bicycle lane, or is it just if it's just immediately adjacent to a vehicle lane, a motor vehicle lane?
Well, the way the standard
That would be helpful.
Yeah, and certainly I can investigate that a little further. But the way the standard is showing, as you can see, let me increase that a little bit for better viewing, is that it's showing the parklet
starting at 2 foot, but it doesn't describe any sort of a barrier, if you will, within that being the parklet itself. And I think the case that we have right now in state right away is that K-railing line lies within this 2 foot area.
Yeah, and I guess Carrie, the other issue with that would be it's if Caltrans is okay with the K rail being in that or whatever the barrier is in that 2 feet, and that's fine where we have the bike lanes, but on the other side of Main Street, if someone wanted to do a parklet, we don't have the bike lanes, and then they'd end up with a teeny tiny little parklet,
Yeah. So I can inquire.
Okay,
With,
and I think for our own standards, we would have flexibility, like if someone wanted to do it on a city right of way, we would have our own flexibility to allow it within that, to be within that same distance and not require the 2 feet free.
I'm just looking at the Caltrans. I'm just seeing if Caltrans standards have anything about, a heavy barricade kind of idea. I'm not seeing anything about that.
So to just not be wordsmithing this all night long, I'm just going to suggest that maybe we look at this with GHD and try to figure out an answer to some of this stuff about the width stuff so that it's
That would be great.
give us the most flexibility we can.
Yeah, I would like to have some flexibility there, I guess, and with the understanding of we're talking about a fairly limited amount of space, and if there's a way that we can craft some kind of something that we're comfortable with in terms of a barrier to the traffic flow side of the parklet, I think that would be helpful.
And Carrie, are we on a kind of a time schedule as far as to try to get this to city council? Is this something that with all these changes can come back to planning commission, or is that going to really delay things and not really?
If I could send out informational, I know the budget is limited for this, and we've already added in one extra design guideline meeting with this group. So I'm happy to report back if there's a written report with the resolution, if that would be acceptable.
Okay, yeah, you okay with that? Because I know there's been a lot of changes and suggestions. It'd just be nice to be able to see some of that or.
Yeah, and I have looked at, after the comments from both Christine Lovell and Lars and Paul at the design guideline subcommittee, I did look through the San Francisco stuff, and I would say, I mean, it's a huge document. It's bigger than our document, so I don't think it's maybe necessarily appropriate for appendix, but I think there should be at least some way of referencing, because they actually have a lot of good ideas about how to make them look artistic and interesting and not just the wine barrels or the planter boxes and the very typical. Some of them are pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And I think could really, as Paul, as you were saying earlier, kind of inspire people a little bit.
Yeah, I just think that they have just such great visual. They have so many examples that have been built over the years, and there's so many of them that are really cool that they include in their manual that kind of gets your creative juices flowing.
Yeah,
more.
and it's a public document because it's on their website. So all we need to do is, maybe a picture or two and a link.
Yeah.
So,
and the guy who runs their, I mean, the guy Robin, who kind of runs their program, he came up here years ago, and we had him do a kind of a presentation, and he's super generous with all that stuff, and I'm sure they would have no issue with us cribbing whatever we could crib.
Most public agencies, it's like we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we'll know it'll get paid back to us at some point.
Yes, exactly.
That stuff.
It's just such limited space that we have, and it's just it doesn't take much to have people just say, well, we have this ordinance, but no one's going to use it because it's too restrictive. But I think it's a good idea to give them some ideas, some thoughts, for that. So, okay. So Mario gets and Carrie, I think you guys have enough. What you think you need?
Yeah, Mario, do you and your Frank and Kara, do you have what you need?
I think we've got plenty of input, yes, and certainly a little more tinkering to do on the guidelines. And then as being suggested, perhaps in a report, Carrie, you would share something back with the commission.
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you.
Simpson?
Not much like that.
For your
Well,
time
thank you.
And creativity. Appreciate it. Okay. Well, thank you for patience of Sonoma County Legal Aid Representative. We move on to item 5B, Sonoma County Legal Aid presentation on tenant issues. And Carol, maybe you can get us started on background there.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you, Chair Fernandez. So yeah, so we have Margaret, and I can't pronounce your last name.
Mario.
Thank you. Mario here tonight. She was one of the commenters when we had our housing element public hearing at both the Planning Commission and City Council. So I want to first thank you for your comments and input in that. As you might recall, the Planning Commission did add we already had a program regarding education of decision makers on housing items. And so we added a specific element regarding education and looking at possible tenant issues. And so we've invited Margaret here tonight, and she's generously going to be giving us a presentation related to some of the things she had commented on, which I think, I will say I know sort of a little bit about some of them, but I think it'll be a great learning experience for all of us. The intent tonight is to kind of get some information on what's out there in terms of tenant rights, get some base information. And then if followed by some discussion by the commission, if there are items that you feel would be really helpful for the city of Sebastopol that we want to recommend, then the process would be for this, and this is a regular agenda item, so you can provide input, and the process would be to bring it to City Council to see if they are interested in having the Planning Commission pursue any of these policies, and provide, get guidance from them. Some of them do involve landlord issues, which can become a little bit political. And so we do want to make sure that our council would be on board as well. And I've already let Margaret know that she might need to redo some form of this presentation to City Council as well. So with that, I will happily turn it over to Margaret, and I will get the screen share up in a sec.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Congratulations on being the first city to have your housing element plan approved in Sonoma County. I think Anne Marin. That's super exciting. I apologize that I didn't get you these slides in advance, but to be honest, I'm pretty maxed out. So I finished them up today. But generally, when I'm talking about policy, I think it's really important that we're on the same page about like what is the law, what are the procedures that a tenant faces around their tenancy if it's being threatened or at risk, if displacement is a factor. So that being said, I'm the policy attorney, so my job is really to look at community needs, and some of that is done by working with our housing team. Legal Aid is funded partially to provide right to counsel for people who are low income or seniors facing eviction. So we represent probably it's around 58-60%. It's not a super scientific number, but of the folks that end up in court with an eviction. So I would say it's a majority of the people who are there. And so we see the trends, we see what's going on in the county. And our services are available to anyone who's low income, regardless of immigration status. which is important, obviously here. Other, depending on the funding type, other orgs that do provide this kind of service cannot represent people who are undocumented. So legal aid generally picks up every person who is undocumented. And so we're very familiar with the specific needs and, face risks that they have to live with. And one of them is fear of losing their housing. And then seniors, regardless of income, can get assistance from legal aid. And that includes, we represent landlords in foreclosure prevention, primarily eviction defense, but we also do unlawful rent increases, including price gouging. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. Also with habitability issues, which we've seen an uptick in. And we have a homelessness prevention team, as you might know, who've been very active in Sebastopol with the parking, RV parking. And then my position, the housing policy attorney. And so the next slide, sorry, I'm on, next slide is a pie chart. And it's probably hard to read, so I'll tell you. In 2022, this chart, and we'll make sure that you get the slides after. This chart is a breakdown of where our clients came to us from. And obviously a majority come from Santa Rosa. But, you can see that some of the further out jurisdictions, people have a harder time traveling to Santa Rosa for assistance. So we're always working on community outreach. We recently did a community outreach at Sebastopol Library. So we're trying to come to the people so that they don't always have to come to us. And I wanted to share some data because this is the number one thing that elected officials ask me for. And I happen to have some. It wasn't easy to get. Evictions are by law restricted from public access. So you can't, to protect tenants and their credit, you can't ask for all the court records on all the evictions, but you can ask for things that don't include personal information. That would be the next slide. And so I worked with the county to get this data from the court, the Superior Court. And this is court eviction. So it doesn't include all the people who move out in response to an eviction notice, a notice terminating tenancy, which, I'm a career landlord tenant attorney, and I stopped practicing when I took this job, but I would say that, the court eviction rate probably captures 50% of the actual eviction rate, or less even, because a lot of people, like I said, when there's a power imbalance, a power dynamic is not the same between a landlord and a tenant. Tenants move out in response to an eviction notice. And that, that comes into the education piece of it to make sure that tenants know their rights. It's always hard for me to accept that tenants don't have access to that information because of just how different it is in the rest of the country. We do have a lot of protections here, but if the tenants don't know about it, they don't know, for instance, they have a right to a jury trial in an eviction. And so if they didn't know that, they would be scared of an eviction being on the record. The record is restricted as to the public unless a judgment is entered against the tenant, in which case it can go onto their credit. So I've seen it have, lifetime consequences for people that have an eviction on their record. So in Sebastopol specifically, before the pandemic, the average rate of evictions per year was 38. And that is, let's see, based on the renter population from the housing element, which is on a different slide, that's 2.27% of the renter population here. And then in 2020, we had the Tenant Protection Act, which took effect January 1st. And it was in effect for 3 months, essentially, not even until then the COVID pandemic hit. And that's when state, federal, local eviction moratorium started kicking in. So ultimately, do we really know the impact of that state law, which I'll go over? Probably not. But being a policy nerd, I can see that there are a lot of loopholes. We saw some of the loopholes during the moratorium, which led us to just cause ordinance in Petaluma getting passed. So I can talk about those in a minute, but I just wanted to note this because we can see what impacts a moratorium has on the eviction rate. So in Sebastopol, in 2021 and 2021, there were 25 evictions. And that was the full year of eviction protection for tenants. Didn't mean they couldn't be evicted. It just meant that they couldn't be evicted for the usual reasons. But if they were a threat to public health and safety, if they had non-COVID related non-payment of rent, or they the landlord wanted to stop being a landlord and withdraw from the rental market, which is under a state law called the Ellis Act, they could still evict. That's the loophole that we saw abused the most often, is people would say, yeah, I'm withdrawing from the rental market, evict somebody, and then raise the rent to market rate. We saw it over and over again, but it's hard to prove. And it's also, if there's no local ordinance in effect, there's no standing for a tenant to come back and say, hey, you lied, you violated the law. You didn't actually go out of the rental business. And so like I have here, moratoriums were still allowed. They still allowed some evictions to occur. That's probably the number one thing I hear. Another thing I hear about moratoriums or just cause ordinances is that landlords weren't able to evict. And I push back on that narrative a little bit, because we know that they're able to evict because we defended the evictions, but also we represented landlords whose tenants were an extreme threat to their safety. And generally that would include like a restraining order, but also, potentially an eviction if it was, a senior or a low income landlord. Another thing that I like to think about before talking about policy is cost burden. So how much somebody pays for their housing essentially. And per the housing element, which has lots of great data for me to pick through, 20%, roughly 20% of households in Sebastopol spend 50% or more on their income on housing. This is a severe cost burden. 40% of renters spend over 30% of their income on housing, compared to 32% of people who own their home. And one thing that always stood out to me is that, because I live here outside city limits, but I'm a renter, and the fact is that there are just a little bit more people who occupy a rental housing than own their housing here in Sebastopol. So ultimately that, after looking at all the housing elements countywide and all of their data, Sebastopol has the largest renter population in the county. Generally the number is between 30 and 40%. So it's a very important population to consider in policy and consider their vulnerability. It's also can be an equity issue because, Black and Latinx Indigenous persons are disproportionately renters. So are female-led households. The highest rates of eviction nationwide are among Black female-led households. So if we're thinking about it from an equity framework, housing policy or stabilizing tenants is one way to impact, the racial equity in a jurisdiction. So the next slide has the existing tenant protections, which when you get these, they're hyperlinked. So you can check them out, but the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 I mentioned is referred to frequently as AB 1482. And that is the state came together and finally passed a statewide just cause, eviction protection, and a rent cap. It's not quite rent stabilization. But that's something new. That's something that we use in court as a defense to an eviction. But because it doesn't cover so many different types of units, especially in Sonoma County, people frequently are left out of the realm of its protections. And that's why we're here talking about what can we do locally to close those loopholes. There's also mobile home residency law, which governs, it's really kind of a rules law around mobile home parks. It's not just cause protection. There's, Sebastopol has a local mobile home rent stabilization ordinance, like a lot of the jurisdictions in the county. There is Penal Code 396, which is frequently triggered in Sonoma County. It is a state law against price gouging during a state of emergency. So it's really been in effect since, let's see, the Tubbs fire, and then that one expired, and the Kincaid fire has been continued by the Board of Supervisors every 60 days for years now. So that protection is still in existence and it's available for tenants. And then Carrie informed me that I wasn't aware, what very exciting, that locally there's a price gouging protection here in Sebastopol that includes some level of eviction protection. And also something that's considered a pro-tenant policy would be a condo conversion ordinance, which is in existence here. The reason being, if developers say they buy a building and it's full of tenants and they think, oh, we can evict them all and sell these as condos and make tons of money. This is something that will, step in and provide some level of protection against displacement. And so the next slide, I'm not going to read the whole slide, but I want you to have the information. So there's two parts of AB 1482. There's the just cause ordinance and there's a rent cap. Here's some of the loopholes. It only applies after 12 months, whereas, there's 30 just cause ordinances locally around the state. And Petaluma was the 30th. And over 90% of them start at day one of the tenancy. So under state law, tenants are not protected until they've been there 12 months or more. Tenant can't be terminated unless the landlord has a just cause. A just cause is like a good cause, a good reason, not no reason. For instance, they didn't pay their rent, or they were, breached the lease in some way. They were a nuisance. They were disturbing their neighbor, as an example of nuisance, repeatedly disturbing their neighbor. And so the state identified certain reasons that a tenant can be evicted, including no fault reasons. So there's generally, three kinds of major no fault evictions that happen. Ellis Act, which I mentioned, when the landlord says they're withdrawing from the rental market. Owner move-in, where they're moving themselves or a relative in. Substantial rehab, where they're going to renovate, and under the state law, they can evict you for that and you don't get to come back. So that's a huge loophole, especially because there's no proof that the landlord actually rehabilitated or did any renovation. So, and then the basic crux of it is that just because your lease expired, that's not actually a reason you can be evicted. So even though it's a contract, if you have just cause protections, that contract rolls over to a month-to-month basis. And then the rent cap is so annual rent increases cannot exceed 5% plus the local CPI rate, or 10%, whichever is lower. And 10% is quite a bit. Like for me, I rent, I pay market rate. 10%, 3 years in a row, I would not be able to afford it. So, there is a huge incentive for localities to reduce this amount, absent, any amendments at the state level. Rent increases that take effect before, well, I'm not going to go into that. It's pretty tricky to calculate what the actual allowable rent increase is. So, if one know of is having issues with that, they should come to legal aid or speak to an attorney. And then it doesn't apply to mobile homes. So mobile homes have their own specific protections generally, because it's a unique situation where they own the home, but they rent the land underneath it. So they're very vulnerable in that way because they have this huge investment, but they, if they're kicked out of it, they can't just be evicted. There's specific rules around mobile home parks for that reason, and because they're primarily occupied by seniors. So in Sebastopol, chapter 9.28 of the municipal code is the rent stabilization ordinance. It limits rent increases to no more than 100% of the change in local CPI, which this past year was 5.7%, or 6%, whichever's lower. So there was a huge movement by residents who tend to be very organized and very aware of their rights in Santa Rosa, but it started, Santa Rosa and Windsor. And they both recently amended their mobile home stabilization ordinance to Santa Rosa's is 70% of the CPI or 4%, whichever's lower. And Windsor also passed theirs as an urgency ordinance to make sure that seniors weren't going into the holidays, with this fear of rent increase that they wouldn't be able to pay. So they passed it into effect immediately. And they were, really, it was really impressive how quickly they acted. And the fact that they did it as an urgency, it really showed respect for the seniors who, they show up at these meetings and they're very vocal about what this impact could be. Could be a medication they can't afford. It could be, certain groceries they don't buy. It could be a utility that they don't pay or shut off. So it has a huge impact, and the lessons learned from this, include the effect on seniors, and also just the fact that it wasn't challenging for the Windsor Town Council to pass this. And ultimately it wasn't, you might have seen it in Santa Rosa's in the paper because it didn't go as well as they planned. It didn't apply in time to cover all the parks. In Sebastopol, there's really one park that this would affect, but I hear from them. Whenever I, do outreach with the Golden State Mobile Homeowners Association. So, just because there's one, I don't know how many units it is, but this is something that the city could do that would, fit within like ticking boxes of the housing element in which you're protecting vulnerable seniors. Also, mobile home parks are basically the last naturally occurring affordable housing. And so preserving that affordability, not just for the existing tenants, but for future tenants, is important. So the next slide is on price gouging. As I said, the state of emergency, whether it's local, federal, or state, it triggers this law, the Penal Code 396. So right now we're under the Kincaid state of emergency. Now we're also under flood states of emergency, federal and state and local. So if one of those expires, we just kind of kick back to the whatever is still in effect. Ultimately, you can't raise the rent more than 10% of what was charged at the time that the state of emergency was triggered. And so for the Kincaid fire, we're talking about October 2019. So a landlord cumulatively cannot raise the rent more than 10% of what that rent was. So maybe every year they do a 2% increase, but ultimately they cannot exceed a total of 10%. And we get a lot of clients who have been served eviction or rent increases that exceed that amount, especially if they're not covered by the state 10% cap. And usually, hopefully, it's all it takes is a letter from legal aid to tell the landlord why they're in violation. But that's another education piece that I don't think a lot of landlords really understand. And I don't think a lot of tenants know about. Sebastopol has their own prohibition on rental housing price gouging and a restriction on lease terminations during a state of emergency. It is its initial term is 6 months, and it can be extended in 6 month terms, by the way I read it. So, there's one part of your existing code that could potentially be amended to make it a little more protective. There's currently a lot of support for a disaster-related moratorium that's triggered automatically by a state of emergency. And I think that is an easier lift because obviously we want to stabilize the community during a state of emergency. And unfortunately, in Sonoma County, we have so many, So it's a place for us to lead. And I think Sebastopol's already got something that a lot of people don't know about, including me until today. So it's a good place for a pilot or a program that could lead the county. Ultimately, we will be campaigning for that at the county level. So you guys already kind of have it. So something that I thought would be a potential amendment would be to add a moratorium on evictions except for limited and necessary reasons that the city council would decide what would be an acceptable reason during a disaster. I already went over what the existing moratorium was at the county level. That language is already out there. And that was very protective. It actually reduced the unlawful detainer rate at countywide by 66%. So we know it kept people out of homelessness. And there are state studies on that, on the effect of the moratoriums. There's data out there that shows that it impacted the rate of homelessness. It's just a matter of what will we do with that information, make sure that it's not lost. So I just wanted to put out some basic tenant rights. Like if we were doing an educational piece, I would go through all of these. I do a lot of Know Your Rights presentations with tenants, and essentially educate them about what is tenant harassment, how, what a landlord is allowed to do. There's, a lot of fear amongst tenants of retaliation, discrimination and harassment. These are all prohibited by law, but they don't have a great enforcement mechanism. So like the city of Concord passed anti-harassment ordinance recently, and that's kind of becoming more popular, just to protect tenants from things that should be illegal, but just there's no standing for a tenant to complain about or to sue for. I used to sue landlords for tenant harassment, and in San Francisco, they have a tenant harassment ordinance 37.10b that just lays out the specific things that constitute harassment. And one of them could be that the next slide is landlord obligations to provide safe and habitable rental units. One of them could be refusal to remedy these kind of conditions like holes, pests. We have a lot of mold cases right now that obviously with the rain, the leaky roofs that you don't know about all year are all leaking right now. And that's, across the state, but in San Francisco, it never rained. And then, maybe for 2 weeks in December, tenants would get damp conditions, and that would lead to mold, which would lead to peeling lead paint, because if the walls are moist, the paint peels. And so for families, it's a huge deal. Not a lot of great collaboration between code enforcement around those things. Department of Building Inspection and, would punt to the Department of Public Health, and they would, who's responsible for mold and peeling paint. It was very hard to get an inspector out to make a citation. So that's all the conditions that the landlord has to provide. They have a duty to provide. Those are all governed by Civil Code 1941.1. And then on the next slide are the remedies tenants have. As I said, more tenants are coming in with damp, lack of effective weatherproofing, mold. There's a lot of pest infestations in certain parts of the county. And the remedy for tenants is really, to complain. And where do they complain to? They could complain to legal aid, but we say, have you complained to someone else, like the landlord? Have you complained to code enforcement? We figure out who the code enforcement officer or mechanism is. Sometimes in this county, that is not a strong mechanism. They have rights under Civil Code 1942. They can withhold rent. Never recommend they do that. But it just puts them at risk of non-payment eviction and proving the habitability conditions. We actually have a trial on that next week where a tenant did withhold rent because it got so bad. They can move out. That's called constructive eviction. It's where the conditions are so unlivable that you have to leave. It's a horrible scenario. And they could sue. A lot of tenants cannot find a lawyer to sue. In San Francisco and other jurisdictions where there's an ordinance providing for attorney's fees for those kind of lawsuits, then you can find a private attorney to sue for you because they know they'll get paid. The tenant can't afford to pay a lawyer, but they do a contingency fee agreement where the lawyer only gets paid if they win. So those kind of scenarios really need to be in effect to make some of the laws that we talk about enforceable. It also takes a burden off of a local jurisdiction to enforce. So having attorney's fees provisions around this kind of stuff gives it just gives tenants really a leg to stand on in asserting their rights.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we could take a 5-minute break
Sure,
before we continue.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
no
Yeah,
problem.
exactly.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So what time? So yeah, okay. 8 o'clock. You good?
8 o'clock.
Right.
Yeah, we'll begin again at 8
Okay.
o'clock. Thank you. And thank you, Paul. I was actually going to ask for that before we started this presentation.
It was like 3-2. I think so, yeah. Yeah, I tried to hang on to make a comment on that. I didn't make it.
Yeah, we could continue.
Yes,
Okay.
hold on, let me
Okay.
just get us back to the screen share. Okay, Margaret, whenever
Okay.
you're ready.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. So I was just talking about tenants' remedies for poor conditions in rental units. So one thing that is important to note is that there is a policy remedy for this. Proactive rental inspections are one way that a local jurisdiction can take the burden off of tenants to complain, tenants who live in fear of retaliation for complaining. A lot of tenants just live with these conditions because they don't want to lose their housing. So a proactive rental inspection has, basically a system of maybe annually, every 2 years, every 3 years, where someone would come and inspect, landlords would register their rental units, and then code enforcement would do an inspection. And then there's other variables, like if the landlord, passes with flying colors, they might get a pass for the next round, or newly constructed buildings get certain exemptions for a period of time. And then landlords who fail the inspection would have, more frequent code enforcement. So there are a lot of models for this statewide. There are, Fresno has one, Los Angeles has probably one of the better ones. But it definitely is something to consider. And I think I'll cover that a little bit more just in a few slides down, but I would be remiss not to talk about the unlawful detainer process, just so you all know what it takes to evict a tenant and, what a tenant has to go through in an eviction. So there is a legal process. A landlord is prohibited from changing the locks or engaging in self-help. Although in Arkansas, apparently it's illegal for a tenant not to pay their rent. So, the laws vary across the country. But here in California, a tenant is entitled to an eviction notice. And generally that could be a 3-day notice for non-payment or nuisance. Or it could be a 60-day notice. It could be a 30-day notice. It could be 120-day notice. It just depends on what the local laws are and the state laws. So a landlord can't do anything until the notice period expires. And that's when a tenant is considered unlawfully holding over, unlawfully detaining a unit. But technically it's not unlawful because the tenant is entitled to due process through the court before they can be evicted. So the tenant has to be served. not by the landlord. After the notice expires, the tenant has to be served. The landlord has to file what's called an unlawful detainer action with the court, get a summons, and then have that served on the tenant. The tenant has only 5 court days to file their response. So at legal aid, we get a lot of people who are like, oh, I just served something like 4 days ago. I don't know what it was. And we're like, well, did it look official? And did you recognize the person who gave it to you? And did they knock on your door really hard? So, we have to be able to look at the document, see if there are any defenses that we can raise with like a motion to, before going to trial, like a motion to get rid of the case because it's defective. And so that's kind of eviction defense. That's what we do. And sometimes there is no defense, and sometimes we end up just helping a tenant get a soft landing. The next slide, it just finishes out this process. If a tenant doesn't know, we have people with disabilities. We have people, who just didn't know they were served. If they don't file a response, landlord gets what's called a default judgment, and they can get a sheriff's eviction with that. So it's really critical that tenants respond, that tenants get legal advice, like from a lawyer, not from a non-lawyer. And so I always harp on that, like they need to come to legal aid or talk to an attorney who is familiar with landlord tenant law. And if they do file a response, once they file it's called an answer, the landlord has, they can set it for trial. The way eviction court works in Sonoma County is everybody goes to eviction, the real property court on the same day at the same time, no matter what process they are in. So the motions are heard, the trials are disposed of, the default judgments are secured. So it's really a hodgepodge of, kind of a lot of different kinds of sadness. But ultimately in Sonoma County, most tenants who go to court end up settling their case. The court kind of pushes them into settlement, and there's settlement judges, and they encourage them to move out. And so the reason that tenant protections are important is, we don't really have that many tools in Sonoma County once the tenants are in court. Whereas in other jurisdictions, we have a lot of tools, and maybe we could get that case thrown out. But here, it's definitely more lopsided towards the landlords. They get recovery of possession. A lot of times they don't, the tenants don't get super favorable settlement. Sometimes they get a money judgment. A lot of tenants owe back rent at this point. We're seeing a lot of non-payment evictions. So I didn't put in here, but emergency rent assistance programs like we had during COVID, they're gone. And there's a few local programs, but there's no like great centralized emergency rent assistance program. So if somebody comes to us owing like $3,000, that probably means they have a lower rent, right? Maybe 3 months of rent or 2 months of rent behind by the time the landlord will go to court to evict them. Sometimes 1 month. Sometimes the rent's $5,000 a month and they owe $30,000. I mean, it really varies. But, a lot of jurisdictions have these kind of programs in place for the lower back rent amount so that they can do what's like a pay and stay, where someone will step in, pay the back rent. If the tenant can prove they're going to pay the rent going forward, the tenant gets to stay so long as they pay the rent. So I'm going to pivot to policies to stabilize renters. The first thing I want to mention, and when I first came to Sonoma County, I thought we should definitely have rent stabilization and just cause. Now I'm, a year and a half into a just cause campaign in Petaluma, and I'm like, let's start at a rental registry. A rental registry sounds a lot, but essentially, in order for us to make good policy decisions, I admit, need data. And the court evictions do not tell the whole picture. The legal aid intake does not tell the whole picture. We don't know how many people are displaced by an eviction notice, by landlord harassing them to leave, saying, you got to leave, I'm going to kick you out. I'm going to raise your rent. Oh, you asked for heat. I'm going to raise your rent. These kind of tactics are really a way to bully tenants into giving up their rights. So we can't quantify that, you know, and even in the housing element, like we couldn't really quantify what is the status of rental housing and tenant issues in Sebastopol, where over half the population rents without a registry. It can be used to collect data on evictions, identify systemic housing issues, you know, if maybe there is like a lot of price gouging here happening, but we don't know, you know, unless they come to legal aid. We don't know. And it can also be used to facilitate the proactive rental inspection program I mentioned. One cool thing is that, you know, there is a company who does most of the registries in the state now. So even places like San Francisco that had an alleged rental registry for years, when I practiced there, it wasn't actually a registry because it wasn't being enforced. They really didn't have a good idea of how many actual rental units they had. So they hired this company, 3DI Systems. And normally I wouldn't like promote a company, but they're the only one who does this. And they help localities implement registries and other things. So the baseline is a registry. So for an example, I met with them and I asked, you know, took a while for them to tell me a price, but I said, you know, Petaluma, say they have 20,000 renters, how much would it be? And it was 33,000 startup. So the city would have to cough up 33,000 and then about $100,000 a year to maintain. And it's self-maintaining. It can be paid for with a nominal fee to landlords per unit. So, you know, depending on the amount of how big the registry is, between like 30 and 50, $60 a year. I mean, a year. You have to think about how much profit they make. And in like in some jurisdictions, the landlord can pass that cost down to the tenant, unless they're low income. Some jurisdictions just pay that cost for the landlords because the landlords otherwise would be really against it. Either way, if it's done well, it's budget neutral. So it's a way to get data that is, you know, not going to cost a jurisdiction. And if you think about how much money goes into homelessness prevention, this is homelessness prevention. It is taking the information that each landlord has individually and saying collectively as a community, we want you to share that information with us so we can make informed policy decisions for what our community needs. Maybe we don't need a just cause ordinance, you know, but there's no way to really know that without a registry. And then the next slide is rent control, which is like kind of a dirty word in Sonoma County. So I call it rent stabilization, but it is, we all kind of know what rent control is. Limits how much a landlord can raise the rent on an existing tenant each year. Different places tie it to different allowable amounts. But it's to maintain affordability. And it's to create stability for renters. So they can't be priced out of their homes. And ultimately, it creates stability in the long term for renters. You know, a lot of my clients in San Francisco were, 80. I had somebody who was 99 who'd been renting since like World War II, the same unit. I mean, that was housing stability for this person. And they were evicted through the Ellis Act. So developer bought the property, kicked out all the tenants, and then converted them to some other thing that they could sell and made a bunch of money. So rent control prevents speculation. And we're seeing speculation nationwide where corporations are buying up rental properties, corporations in Florida, for instance, and renting them out at market rate. That's their model. And they don't make improvements to the property. And tenants are stuck living there. They can't get basic repairs made. And there's no way to hold them accountable, some Florida corporation. So tenants, eventually move out because they can't deal with it. And it's not quite here yet in Sonoma County, but there is a movement towards buying up single family homes, which is a huge form of our rental stock. And it's part of why tenants are not covered by the state protection, because single family homes are excluded. And so this movement towards buying up single family homes, if that took root here, that would be really devastating. So it's important. I appreciate the opportunity to even talk about this, because I think, trying to get ahead of this is important. I don't mean to be like a doomsayer, but if you can Google it, it's a trend nationally, and it's happening in other parts of California. An easier lift would be to amend the mobile home rent stabilization ordinance, as I talked about before. You're supporting seniors, you're supporting naturally occurring affordable housing. There's different ways to enforce a rent stabilization ordinance. Hopefully you have a rental registry. Tenants can use it as a defense to eviction, or wrongful rent increase. Tenants can sue for violation of it. You could criminalize unlawful rent increases and make that enforceable by like the local city attorney or district attorney, or whoever it may be. City manager, city attorney. Doesn't mean they're going to take the bait, but just having that in the law as a backup. Like in San Francisco, the city attorney's office does sue landlord. They go after landlords, and it is a misdemeanor to violate their ordinance. And there are fines associated with it, which I'll pay for the whole thing. Rent control is not new to Sebastopol, I learned. I was excited to learn that, a temporary moratorium on rent increases over 3% was passed with urgency by the city on November 1st, 2016. And then it was extended on December 6th, 2016 for 6 months. So it's not new here. I think that's awesome. You're not starting from scratch. This has happened before. It could happen again. It could be passed as a pilot program, with limited duration. It's easier to pass as a pilot. If it was passed with a registry as a pilot, you could gather data and determine if it's needed or not. So the next one is just cause eviction limitations. And these protect tenants from being evicted without a specific justification. So as I talked about, non-payment, breach, the no fault reasons that I mentioned. So the state has a just cause law, and it, like I said, it has a lot of loopholes that tenants fall through. It doesn't cover a lot of types of rental units. Specific to Sonoma County, the single family home and duplex exemption leaves a lot of tenants without any protection. Ideally, you pair rent control with just cause. It prevents landlords from evicting tenants via just cause, just so they can raise the rent. That's the most stabilizing thing anyone could probably do. Obviously, there would be a huge opposition from the real estate lobby and landlords. And so that is a big lift that jurisdiction needs to be prepared for if they're going to do something like that. Again, there's enforcement mechanisms, just like with rent control that I mentioned. And then proactive rental inspections, I kind of already talked about that, but you take the burden of the complaint-based system off tenants, and you just, you stabilize them regardless of whether or not they're willing to complain about something. And there is, a climate impact to it, in that if a jurisdiction wants to say phase out like gas appliances, and you have a rental registry, you could potentially identify all the gas appliances in, over half of Sebastopol units. And, maybe there's a subsidy that will come at some point to help landlords swap out those appliances for electric. But it's definitely something the former Petaluma City Council was interested in. So pass a tenant bill of rights. That's a very kind of, it's a way that we can acknowledge that tenants have a valuable form of housing. Everybody talks about homeownership as like the ultimate American dream. And for some people that will never be a reality, and definitely here. personally for me, it's, not currently and has never been a reality. And a lot of my friends, we always talk about if we'd only bought something 10 years ago. Um, but, rental housing is just as valuable. It's a roof over someone's head and it's a homelessness prevention mechanism. So, Biden recently passed a tenant bill of rights. It's not enforceable, but it is a guideline for states if they want to take certain actions to protect tenants. So it would include a lot of what we've talked about, but other, policy options that I just wanted to bring up, I listed here. One example is a higher relocation payment and longer notice period for a no cause eviction. So when tenants are being evicted to no fault of their own, they have more of a safety net, even though they'll have to move. Healdsburg has a relocation ordinance. It's not super hard to pass because it protects seniors, people with disabilities. It protects low-income tenants, and they get, I believe it's 3 months of rent to relocate in a no-fault eviction. They're the only city in Sonoma County that has something like that, but it is a model. There are different things we could do, but I think probably the more important things to focus on are like an anti-retaliation ordinance, an anti-harassment ordinance. It just, the retaliation ordinance, it's triggered, there's a rebuttable presumption that if a tenant is being evicted within 6 months of asserting their right, generally their right to repairs, that it's retaliatory. And then the landlord gets the burden to prove that it's not. We use that all the time in court in my practice. And anti-harassment, landlord can't engage in a pattern and practice of conduct intended to influence a tenant to move out. That was very frequently a cause of action in a lawsuit in San Francisco. So just to recap, I included a link. ABAG has, Association of Bay Area Governments has a great website on housing policies, everything I mentioned here and more. So it's linked in the slides, but the policy options that we talked about, rental registry is sort of the baseline. Rent control, if we're talking about rent control, you got to remember mobile homes are different, but that would be something that could easily be amended. And I know it would have a huge impact here, even though there's only one park. I think it's going to be the trend. I think it's going to happen countywide. So just cause ordinance might feel like a heavy lift, but if you do it as an emergency triggered moratorium, maybe not so much. It's already basically in existence. It could just be strengthened. Proactive rental inspection program and tenant bill of rights. These are not everything, and I'm happy to come back or answer questions and talk about other options, things like tenant opportunity to purchase acts, community opportunity to purchase acts, giving basically a tenant a right to buy their unit rather than be evicted. And those kind of things could be subsidized. There can be some sort of, first time home buyers subsidy. There's lots of different ways to, make Sebastopol a place that people can afford and feel secure. So, and that would be the end of my presentation.
So questions from commissioners?
Well, thank you. That was a lot of information.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to having the slide deck. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I'll hope you'll go through that. I'm really interested in you were talking about the, kind of like the sort of corporate purchasing and this kind of real estate trusts that are purchasing properties. If you've seen what is the method to kind of combat that? Is there a way to sort of prevent that from happening? Because I do think that's a real concern.
Yeah. So there could be, at the state level, the Tenant Protection Act doesn't cover single family homes unless they're owned by a corporation or real estate investment trust. What I saw in San Francisco was, owners putting their property into various LLCs So there's lots of ways to, to think about it. But ultimately, most jurisdictions want to protect what the landlord lobby calls mom and pop landlords.
Mhm.
I think that term is a little abused, but not every mom and pop landlord is a good landlord, and I shouldn't even say good. It's because it's frequently, good and bad, corporate, evil corporate versus non-corporate. Generally, corporations might be a little more evil than individuals. But there are ways, but without like a local ordinance, I think you'd have to get really creative about how to protect without actually implementing some sort of protection, right?
Mhm.
So you can implement a local ordinance, but it's preempted by the Tenant Protection Act if it's not stronger than the Tenant Protection Act. So it would have to be maybe additional relocation payments, longer notice periods, and something targeting that corporate speculative takeover of properties. You want to make it like not an inviting environment for that to come in and take root,
Mhm.
essentially.
Mhm. Um, Another question is like how you said you do like a lot of presentations to tenants and things like that. I'm just wondering if you've seen like, because I agree, like a lot of people don't know at all what their rights are as a tenant, and I probably didn't when I was a renter. And have you seen other cities like have some kind of programs or like ways to get word out on how to? I mean, I know we have like a city newsletter, but it often doesn't go to renters. It goes to the homeowner probably. 'Cause
Yeah.
it's tied with a water bill.
Yeah.
So like, I just wonder like, how can you get like a blast of information out to a group of renters effectively? And maybe through the renter registry, like
It's
if
through
you
the
have,
registry.
yeah, they have a renter registry.
It's
Then
just a way to communicate with renters. It's a way to communicate with landlords,
Mhm.
like communicate with landlords around emergencies, around evacuations, and renters too.
Mhm.
It could be used in a lot of different ways, but I don't know of any jurisdiction that has a great education component. I think a lot of jurisdictions rely on that as like a policy that they do. And I don't consider that a policy. I think that's relying on nonprofits to do that work.
Mhm.
And of course, we want to do that work, but we can't get to every person who needs to know things, right?
Yeah.
I think most jurisdictions rely on nonprofit legal service providers to do that work.
Mhm.
And, we have a lot of great organizations here. We have California Rural Legal Assistance. We have Fair Housing Advocates in Northern California. And we have the Sonoma County Tenants Union, who I partner with on tons of things. We gave a presentation here locally at the senior housing. And, it's important for nonprofits to communicate, to partner. Different people can offer different things, but a tenants union is one way to distribute information. And so it's really important to support the tenants union, that allows them to expand and grow and organize tenants at specific buildings and specific complexes. It empowers tenants, and it gives them leverage with the landlord who may not otherwise want to make repairs.
Mhm. I don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay. Linda, do you have any questions?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. We have a vacation rental ordinance, and that displacement of family housing, make it into an Airbnb. I don't know if you've had a chance to see our ordinance, but I think we're pretty proactive. But any comments on that situation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I definitely have sat in on some city council meetings around the vacation rental ordinance here in Sebastopol and across the county, and we've made, I don't know that I made a comment in Sebastopol, but I have at the county level, just in support of vacation rental bans or severely restricting them. And I haven't read Sebastopol's ordinance, but one thing that I would hope was in there is, and it probably isn't, but treating vacation rentals as a business. So businesses require licensing. And that goes to rentals too. I mean, landlords are in business. They made an investment decision, yet frequently they go unregulated. And, we regulate businesses in this country. So having a business license for vacation rentals, especially when there's more than one, not where somebody's relying on it for their retirement income, but, where that's their business model, would be one way to curb it somewhat, I imagine, or limit it. But we're in a housing crisis, and anything that's limiting or affecting our supply is, going to have an impact. Like that's one less rental unit for a family worker, a local emergency worker. One thing that in the experience of, advocating for just cause in Petaluma, I learned that at least a couple of years ago, none of their fire department lived in Petaluma, and some of them had like very, very long commute. So it has a climate impact, but the idea is we need to support our local workforce. So Airbnb and vacation rentals definitely detract from that, So we're fully in support of it, of limiting it, banning it, regulating it.
Trying to think if there was something else. I'm wondering if it'd be great if the city council had listened to this, or that we can have them watch this section, to be efficient with our calling on a wonderful volunteer to educate us. And I appreciate what you've done or are doing. But I'm just going to say that as a comment, that I think, we can come up with things to pass on to the city council. It'd be nice if they were already, primed and looking at this stuff as well. We did at one point want to do a rent control, but it is a big list, and so that never went as far as we would have liked here in Sebastopol. I've been a landlord, I've been a house owner, I've been a renter. My family growing up in LA, we had a little fourplex, and always asked for less rent than the market to get a long, stable tenant, and that was how our family did it. Thank you so much for coming and making a presentation to us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the acknowledgement. It's stuff that I talk about all the time and I could talk about for hours, but I just appreciate, you're the first planning commission who has asked for this information specifically. And I know it needs to go to city council. I'm willing to come back and present to them. And I would love it if they were already prepped in advance so that I don't have to duplicate my efforts, but I'm willing to do that. I mean, this is where I live too. And, this community means a lot to me.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And just for purpose, the city does require business licenses for vacation rentals.
Oh, awesome.
And actually, we require a planning permit so that we can make sure that it's both safe in terms of smoke alarms and all that kind of stuff, but also to make sure that if it is we don't allow them in multi-unit buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And those are considered a non-hosted, and that would require I shouldn't say we don't allow them. We would require a use permit for that, but staff would never be able to support that because of the housing issues. And our planning commission probably would not support that either. Same thing goes for single family homes. So any non-hosted rental where it's not
Yeah.
a room in someone's house where they're trying to get a little bit extra money.
Do apartment buildings and so forth, do they have to just post tenant rights somewhere, just like an employer has to post, employee rights?
No, well, not that I'm aware of. The federally subsidized housing does.
Okay.
And generally, like subsidized housing has to post notice of rights. But what that says, it could vary and it might not include everything.
Is that something that a community could?
We'd all have to agree on what the rights were. And what the notice would say, but yeah, I don't see.
I mean, there's gotta be some standard language or standard bill of rights or.
Well, you saw how long my presentation was.
Mhm. Yeah.
But it depends. If we're talking about habitability standards, it could be pretty long.
Okay.
There are standard forms, like there's habitability checklists and worksheets that you can find online for California that kind of walk a tenant through, like, because there's a lot of things people don't think about, like
Mhm.
all the outlets in my unit don't work, or when I blow dry my hair, the electric goes out and I have to call the landlord to come and flip the circuit breaker in the basement. There's just so many different situations where they either just live with it or they don't know they have a right to it. So it would be helpful.
I mean, even if it's just like that they have to post where they can get information on tenant
Yeah,
rights, you know,
yeah.
with a website or something, to know your rights.
One-
So, yeah.
One good thing is that the court sends out a notice when a tenant is sued.
Mm.
Obviously, it's a little late at that point, but they send out a notice because sometimes tenants don't get served right away with the lawsuit, or sometimes the landlord says they served them. So the court makes sure that the tenants are aware because their housing is at stake. And that notice has legal aid, it has fair housing advocates, California Rural Legal Assistance, I believe, and Petaluma People Services. So, there are that's something that could be like a model. And I'm not sure what the venue would be, but you'd also have to educate landlords that this notice is required.
Yeah.
And then what is the remedy if they don't post it?
Right.
Which all harkens back to a registry.
Mhm. Seems to go back to that. And it's unfortunate, anything the council does is only going to affect, 1.2 square miles or whatever the city limits are. So even though people live in Sebastopol, but if it's outside, that would fall under county.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's me.
So, but maybe, you can do something to kind of lead on that. I don't know if, like, for example, the mobile home rent stabilization, I don't know if that's anything that council has talked about before. I'm just wondering if there may be any items on here that we might want to discuss. Is it something that the council should consider? Is it that we just recommend that they go through this presentation? It seems like there's only one mobile home and that would make a difference. It's a lot of seniors there. Is that something that we should maybe ask the council if they want us to take a look at that? Or, I don't know if there's anything else on here based on the recommendations. Any of the other commission members input on that?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of information that we got tonight that would be interesting. I mean, I think the rental registry is certainly an interesting idea and something I think we should consider exploring. Like I said, it just gives us a lot of information so we know what the situation is. And with so many renters, I think that's an important place to start, really, to talk about that. So yeah, I don't know if I kind of feel bad. There's only 3 of us here tonight that talk about it. It's a lot of it's kind of heavy. And
Right, and we can continue this to a future meeting for
Mhm.
discussion once you've had time. I did just send out the slides so that you can look at the information in the ABAG policy guide and look at some of the examples. And Margaret, if you have other resources that are sort of examples of, say, ordinances
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Petaluma has done or other cities, I can continue to, we can kind of continue this discussion at the next meeting. In the meantime, I can send an email to the city manager and ask him to let the council know that this video, I'll figure out what timestamp it is and
Mhm.
provide a link so that if they want to review it, they,
Mhm.
you know, they can do that. And, yeah.
It seems that what we would need to do as an example, correct me if I'm wrong here, to say, okay, we think that maybe we should look at something in the mobile home, you know,
Sure.
and,
Sure.
you know, is this something you want us to take a look at versus us do the work and say, here's an example? Don't we kind of need to get there?
Yeah, for any of these items,
Mhm.
Chair Fernandez, you're absolutely correct. We should, if there are items that the planning commission feels, hey, we should take a look at this and consider this, we would want to go to city council first
Mhm.
and say, and ask them, do you want us to pursue this?
Yeah, or maybe,
If the planning commission feels this would be helpful,
Yeah.
would you like us to pursue this?
and I don't know if it's helpful forward. I mean, yeah, she has a presentation and then maybe as a summary, the recommendations, and then the council can decide if any of those they might want to take a look at. There might be something easier to start with.
Mhm.
You know, rather than continue, I think we could probably, there's enough information here, right, to say, you know, take a look at this. Is there anything that, you know, you think you want us to?
Right,
look for?
right. And I do think there are a couple things, and I did talk with Margaret, obviously, before this meeting to let her know what we currently had and what some of our issues were. You know, I know when we were working on the housing element, we did talk with our building department, who is a part-time contract person. That is our our only building official / inspector. So we have pretty limited resources in terms of doing the proactive inspection kind of a thing, given the number of units we have in town. So, you know, what would that look like? How many hours of inspections per year? How would you structure? Those are the types of things that, you know, they would generally have, they would have some sort of cost implication, whether it's to city or the landlord, or if it's passed through to tenant. And I think those types of things need to be sort of maybe understood a little bit. And I think, Margaret, I don't know if you have any information on how people are doing those, but that's sort of one of the things I think about. It's like, oh, Steve's now going to be responsible for all of his regular stuff plus 2,000 inspections every 3 years.
Yeah.
Is that something that one poor guy can do, and will we chase him away and he won't ever come back? Because
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a matter of funding, you know, and what the city priorities are. If they want to put more money, if there is more money to put into that, you know, to have an additional inspector. And there are programs statewide that have really varying models, where the inspections happen maybe every 4 years. You know, it doesn't put that outside the realm of possibility.
Mhm.
If those, I think it's what, like 1,600 units or something, if they are inspected every 4 years on like a rolling basis. It's just something to look at. I was in Healdsburg last week for a housing panel, and they mentioned that, you know, they had partnered up with Corazon Healdsburg to assist tenants with reporting habitability conditions, sending a notice to the landlord that comes from the nonprofit rather than the tenant. So that is something that could be considered if you have the right nonprofit to do that work, you know, and they have bandwidth. But it definitely is, you know, is impacting the community, it sounds like. So, and that's another way for people to learn about their rights, you know, is just continuing that kind of work where it builds and grows on itself. And, you know, one tenant tells a neighbor, oh, I went and I heard this, and, you know, word of mouth can be definitely helpful. But I'm happy to pass along like a couple of models. And, you know, there's a lot of model ordinances across the state for other tenant protections. So if, you know, if it's hard for me as one person to say, oh, I think this is the best model or this is the best ordinance, but something to consider is that the small town of Fairfax, you know, they passed just cause on rent control recently. And they're the smallest town in the US that have those protections. Now they're embattled with the landlords right now over whether those protections can last, but it can be done, you know. One thing that they're struggling with is the rent registry aspect of it. You know, how do we administer these laws? How do we enforce them? And, you know, without that underlying foundation, it might be challenging. And that's another reason rental registries are opposed by landlord lobbies, is because landlord lobbies know, oh, once they have a registry and in effect, you know, they'll have the data and we can't argue against data. So that will lead to tenant protections. So anyhow, I'm happy to circle back with additional.
You mentioned, several times that, you know, some of these programs and some of these things are to keep people from being homeless, right?
Oh,
Is there any, you know, state funding available? You know, I know this is kind of forward thinking too much, you know, where they're preventing.
yeah.
Is there any, have you known of any funding to help fund some of these things, or any that you're aware of that?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, there was a lot of funding during COVID, right? Federal and state dollars that were used towards homelessness prevention, you know, programs, including emergency rent assistance, which was hugely impactful. And it wasn't perfect, but it still had a huge impact. The governor has indicated that, you know, we're gonna have budget cuts and we're in a budget deficit, but they, you know, he's also indicated that he doesn't want to cut homelessness prevention money as much. I'm not an expert in finding the money. I try not to be because I don't want to take that on. But there are a lot of different ways to look at homelessness prevention. And now that we have more information from the moratoriums and the emergency rent assistance, you know, we know even from our point in time counts that eviction is one of the top 3 reasons why people are homeless, you know. And then once they get that eviction on their record, they're really stuck. They can't find anyone who will rent to them. I even see that here in Sebastopol and next door. I'm always like, somebody will mention an eviction, or they can't find housing, or they have a voucher and they can't get rented to. And I can't help it. I just chime in a little bit, send them a message, like, go to legal aid. They can't discriminate against voucher holders. You know, you can't just be tossed out for no reason. So anyhow, I don't know if I didn't answer your question.
No, that's
but-
okay. I mean, I'm just wondering if just offhand you happen to know
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Yeah, and I think just sort of thinking about that link, you know, if I see things that might be possible
Yeah.
for that, it's certainly an innovative, especially if there is, you know, locally data that says this is linked to that, and
Mhm.
that's something you can use in, say, a grant application or something
Yeah.
like that for funding. That is always helpful in that.
It would be great if there was a really specific funding source. BAFA is, you know, part of the Association of Bay Area Governments. I don't know that much about BAFA. I don't even know if that last statement was absolutely correct. But they've been outreaching me, you know, asking for my input on what they should do with their potential, like probably millions of dollars in funding. And one of the things that they've identified is that funding for tenant protections. So they can't advocate for specific policies, but they can provide financial assistance around rent registries, around data, different aspects of, you know, how do we get this information? How do we afford it? So they're not fully funded yet, but I anticipate, I think it's in the next 2 years, that potentially another pot of money will open up.
Right. And Margaret, one, I would say, and I think Vice Chair Fritz mentioned the sort of the corporate purchase of homes. I know our vacation rental ordinance was sort of originally written to try to make sure that that did not happen. That's, but if there are any programs or ordinances or anything out there that you do find, I think that's something that the city of Sebastopol would be extremely interested in, would probably be dare I say, a no-brainer because it's very much in the ethos of Sebastopol to
Yeah.
keep it local and not corporations from other
Yeah.
states or countries or anything like that. So,
I also kind of wonder related to the kind of corporate, buying of properties is the second home properties as well. There's
Yeah.
so many people that buy second homes in Sonoma County, vacation homes for
Yeah.
themselves, not rentals, but that, I don't know how you prevent something like that from happening, but there's so many.
Well, there's totally like, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, if you have any.
Yeah.
about that.
I mean, it's on the laundry list, not in this presentation, but some sort of vacancy tax.
Mhm.
There's a vacancy tax enacted in San Francisco, I think recently.
Mhm.
And it could be phrased as a vacancy tax. It could be phrased as a second home tax. There's so many
Mhm.
different ways to regulate that, but the idea of housing stock just sitting there
Mhm.
when we're in a housing crisis,
Yeah.
that's the idea. So,
Yeah.
if you are a homeowner and you're choosing not to, live there or rent it, like, how do we incentivize you to do that? And, there's either like a penalty or, an enticement. So I think there's a lot of ways that can be explored.
Mhm.
And, I'm happy to like put together just some bullet points on it. I think it's something that, as part of a Sonoma County Housing Element Working Group, that had a lot of different people involved with it, including Generation Housing, but we frequently, toss that in as an idea of, how do we regulate that? Because some jurisdictions calculated how many vacant homes they had, and there were a lot,
Mhm.
and what does that say about us as a community? So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think definitely your vacation rental ordinance has an impact on that because that's generally what people might want to do with their second home.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think these are, I think these are great. And I think we should talk about them more. I don't know that I, given that we just, heard all these things tonight, that I could like start prioritizing what I think is most important, but I think it's something we should continue talking about and maybe come up with a priority list and to be able to present
Right.
it to the council and say, look, these are things we think we could possibly do here. These are kind of the priorities. What do you think? Should we explore any of these any
Right.
further?
right. No, I think that, yeah, it's definitely something to be, it's not something a one and done tonight. We're going to get it off our
Yes.
plate. I absolutely with you. This is a lot of really good information, both in the presentation and I think in the resources
Thank you.
to look at. So thank you very much, Margaret. And
Yeah, you're
we'll
welcome.
probably be inviting you back at some point.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Invite me back before we all forget what we talked about.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Margaret, is it okay if I post this to our website, the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yep. So next up is the commission training, but we're missing 2 members and I'm wondering.
Yes, and it's also pretty late.
Yeah.
So I think you and I had talked about if these were really quick presentations, which they were not, which is great. They were really good presentations. But yes, I do. If the chair wished to continue that,
Would like
meeting,
to-
I'd be more than pleased.
No, I think that's a good, no, I think I think with only 3 of us here,
Yeah.
I think those trainings are better when we're all present.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
sure.
So we'll, I guess, table that 6 C. And we'll move on to subcommittee updates. If there's any? And
I think the only subcommittee that has met was the design guidelines subcommittee, which we had a
Talked about
report on last meeting and then the parklets tonight. So I think we've covered that one.
we'll cover that. We'll move on to planning director's report.
Thank you. So a few things, I'll keep it brief. As Margaret noted, and as I sent to you last week, we did get the official certification of our housing element from HCD. So, and now you've just had step 1 of implementation of a very long list of steps. On that front, so that was great news for us, and we're really happy, and we'll have to celebrate at some point, somehow, before we start in on all of the hard work. I did submit a grant, speaking of that. ABAG, Association of Bay Area Governments, had a grant application due a couple weeks ago for priority development areas. The city of Sebastopol does have one. We have never submitted for a plan for our PDA. What I submitted was not for the entire PDA, which is probably like 60% of the city and maybe a little bit more bigger than it should be, I think. So we need to look at kind of making that maybe a little bit more strategic. But what I did submit for was a grant to do the workforce housing overlay, which I'm also starting to call a little bit of a flex zoning, thinking about the flexibility of South Main Street and Healdsburg, where there's really that mix of, residential and commercial, and allowing things to be more flexible. As well as kind of the second component of that is potentially looking on the north side of town. Obviously, there's the underutilized commercial on the one side, and then the Redwood Marketplace as a potential, what could that look like? We've been talking about that at the Design Guidelines Subcommittee a little bit. So I think Paul's probably aware that we've been starting to kind of talk about how could we leverage the objective design standards for these next steps in the housing element. So I did submit a grant application for that. The resolution of support for that is going to council next Tuesday. And that report will be out, and then I'll include kind of the grant application and information. It should be out by tomorrow as soon as I finalize the staff report in the morning and Mary is able to get it up. We also next Tuesday at the council meeting have the zoning ordinance amendment for the cannabis co-location and manufacturing zones. And then the other pretty large item on the agenda is an update from the ad hoc committee on fire services. That is, so the PDA grant is just on the consent calendar, so it wouldn't be discussed unless council pulls it. The zoning ordinance obviously is a public hearing, and then the fire services after that. So that's kind of the order on the agenda for those items. I think that's it for upcoming meetings. We will have your March 28th meeting, but we are going to ask that start at 7 p.m. because we have a design review board meeting starting at, I want to say 3:30, 3 or 3:30. Check the website, please, just to make sure all of our meetings have changed times for the other committees under the planning commission. That we think will be running kind of long just because of the particular item on that agenda. So we wanted to make sure we had a little bit of a buffer there. But we will have that meeting on the 28th. And if you have not heard, yes, there was a very large tree that came down in Libby Park today. And I just want to give a kudos out to the city staff, public work crew, and everyone who helped clear that and get that, make sure everyone was safe. I talked to Dante earlier before the meeting and heard a little bit about it, and it's a pretty big mess. So thank you, Public Works.
What part of the park was it?
I believe it was on the western side, and it fell across Pleasant Hill. It fell across Pleasant Hill and across Pleasant Hill.
Wow.
And it's in the Press Democrat, some pictures of it. It was one of those huge, I think, Monterey pines. And I think that's all I have tonight, unless anyone has any questions.
Okay. Questions for Gary? Okay. Linda, you have any questions?
No, just for the 28th for city council.
Commission 7 o'clock.
Yeah, city council is next Tuesday, the 21st at 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, yeah. Do you anticipate it's going to be any longer than what we did? 'Cause you'll make the presentation, right? And then
Yes, we
if
will
they
make
have-
the presentation. I think they've asked for it to be limited to about 10 minutes for staff, so we'll go through it fairly quickly for them.
Okay. All right.
And Linda, are you the planning commission liaison for this month?
I am.
I think we talked about that. So yes, are you able to join us? Because I think that would be helpful in case they have any questions for you.
Yep.
Great, thanks.
Great. Thank you for doing that. All right, if there's nothing else, I will adjourn. And again, reminder, next meeting, 28th will be here, 7 o'clock. Thank you.